Did you know that Ben Shapiro testified in Congress this week? I believe this happened yesterday. Not only did he testify in Congress, which we'll get to in just a second, but he was confronted in Congress before he testified by Code Pink activists. You always got to give it up for Medea Benjamin and the crew because they're always out there doing the damn thing. They seem to be everywhere all the time. I don't know how they do it. I've met them before. I think they're really awesome. But Ben here in this particular clip, he is being confronted by Code Pink about his position on Israel. Listen to this.
How does it feel for you to poison the American public and what you've been perpetuating? Racism, white supremacy, and the genocide that is being carried out on the Palestinian people.
And how does it feel to stand for Hamas? Does that feel good to you? Do you feel good standing in solidarity with a terrorist group that has murdered 1,200
I feel very good standing in solidarity with Palestinian people who have been murdered by Israel, by U.S. paid tax dollars and bombs, and you have continued to spew hate.
Hamas did not start a war on behalf of its citizens and then shoot its own citizens, and you stand for it. Makes you a disgrace
to human dignity and
human
have been
rights.
occupied.
So do you see what Ben Shapiro did there? Again, this is the typical Zionist playbook. This is the same thing that you see like the IDF and other like Zionists that appear onto Piers Morgan's show, that appear onto corporate media. They do the same thing. Once you start to call out Israel, or once you start to call out their actions and their rhetoric, they try to pivot it back to Hamas. They try to pivot it back to that because they don't want to have to answer for the things that they've said and the things that they've done. And Ben Shapiro here is doing the same thing. That's a typical playbook. Listen again.
Poison the American public and what you've been perpetuating. Racism, white supremacy, and the genocide that is being carried out on the Palestinian people.
And how does it feel to stand for Hamas? Does that feel good to you? Do you feel?
See what happened? So now he's like, how does it feel to stand for Hamas? Does that feel good to you? So that he doesn't have to answer her questions about the racist rhetoric that's come from his mouth, the things that he said about Palestinian people. To avoid answering for that, he deflects back to Hamas. Notice they all do this. This is what I was telling you, a typical Zionist playbook move. Pivot it back to Hamas. Don't ever answer for what we've said or what we're doing. Deflecting.
Good standing in solidarity with a terrorist group that has murdered 1,200
I feel very good
Jews
standing in
and keeps
solidarity
people
with Palestinian people who.
So do you see what he did there? He's lying again. He goes, that has killed 1,200 people. Didn't the report come out the other day about the Hannibal Directive that some of those people were killed by the IDF? So there's that. And that was published from Haaretz. Then he goes in to say he was saying they put people into the ovens. That story has been debunked multiple times. So what they tend to do, and Ben Shapiro is no different, they continue to repeat the stories over and over until people believe it, because it can be truth in repetition. If you continue saying something over and over, people will eventually start to soak it up and believe it. But that story has been debunked multiple times, but he's continuing to express that lie. And you'll see a number of them do this, by the way.
Have been murdered by Israel, by U.S. paid tax dollars and bombs, and you have continued to spew hate.
Hamas did not start a war on behalf of its citizens and then shoot its own citizens, and you.
Again, she's talking about how he has spewed hate, and he talks about, well, Hamas has done this, this, and this to their citizens. This is not about what Hamas has done, which a lot of the things that Ben Shapiro has said have been flat out lies in reference to this situation. What she is talking about is the rhetoric that has come from Ben Shapiro's mouth. And this whole attitude, and I'll tell you, this whole attitude that Ben has, which he can go stuff it somewhere, this whole attitude that like, because you have this connection to Israel, that you can't be challenged, that you can't be criticized, that people cannot hold you accountable. This whole I'm better and more holier than thou attitude, you know, what's really getting on my goddamn nerves. It really is. This whole idea that nobody can hold you accountable because of Israel. Nobody else gets this, folks. Nobody else gets this. That is the level that Zionism has got to in that right now. And that was always the plan. That was always the plan. It's just another form of supremacy.
stand for it makes you a disgrace
The people
to
of
human dignity and
Palestine have
human
been
rights.
occupied for 75 years. And the blood is on the hands of every person in this Congress and every person who watches your propaganda of hate, white supremacy, and racism. You have been poisoning the American public for them to also be complicit in what is going on in Palestine. Shame on you and shame on every one of you who have invited them into this building.
So what's important to note there too, notice once she mentioned the occupation, he ran away. They usually don't like to talk about that. They'll run away or they'll interrupt. Now, why was he there? Ben Shapiro was there. Wait for it. Okay. Because he was testifying in front of Congress about protecting free speech. Protecting free speech. The same guy who him and his buddies at the Daily Wire issued a gag order against Candace Owens. That same guy went to Congress and testified about protecting free speech. Get the fuck out of here. Listen to it.
We're in the midst of a trust crisis in the world of media, which is because so many in the legacy media have lied in order to preserve left-leaning narratives. To take just the most recent example, we were told by the legacy media that President Biden was just fine. For years, anyone who questioned his health and mental fitness was trafficking in cheap fakes. And then President Biden went out and engaged in a full-scale mental collapse on stage in front of hundreds of millions of people. So we can see why Americans, at least Americans who are not Democrats, do not trust the media. The question isn't really why the legacy media have lost Americans' trust. We know that answer. The question is why, despite that loss of trust, the legacy media continue to gain share in the advertising market. And the answer is simple. There is, in fact, an informal pressure system created by Democratic legislators, this White House, legacy media, advertisers, and pseudo-objective brand safety organizations.
Pause. So leave it up to him to make this a partisan issue. And I've explained and I've showed you multiple examples on this show that when it comes to free speech, this is not a partisan issue. The greatest example of the right showing hypocrisy about free speech was everything that happened with Israel. Everything that happened. All those guys on the right that were part of the Daily Wire, what did they do? They all decided to get together and gang up on Candace Owens and get her ass out of there. Then once they got her out of there, they issued a gag order against her and told her that she couldn't talk about it. Ain't that a bitch? Think about that. I have many criticism of Candace Owens, but I still thought that little shit that they did, that was sneaky and shady. Not cool. But we're going to talk about free speech. He's going to talk about the media, the corporate media, the advertisers. That's all media. That's all corporate media. That's not just liberal media. And notice how Ben is not going to do that. He's going to blame it on the liberal media. It's not just CNN and MSNBC. It's Fox News too. It's the BBC too. It's Sky News too. They're all owned. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street Group. They're shareholders at these networks. So it's all about what the donor class wants. And so the narrative that you see on corporate media is the narrative that the State Department wants and the donor class wants. That's why you always have to question it. And that includes the narrative that came from corporate media about Israel after October 7th. How many times did they have to go back and debunk what they said because they were lying? How many times did independent media get it right where they got it wrong? But according to Ben Shapiro, this has just happened on the Democrat side.
That system guarantees that advertising dollars flow only to left-wing media brands. Let me explain how this works. When a conservative competitor to the legacy media arises, members of that legacy media and their political allies rush to paint such competitors as dangerous. The commentator Kara Swisher of the New York Times, for example, told the head of YouTube that my videos at Daily Wire were a, quote, gateway drug that would lead children, including her own teenage son, to watch neo-Nazi content. Never mind the yarmulke. Elected Democrats pick up that same messaging. In 2017, Senator Dianne Feinstein told lawyers at Facebook, Google, and Twitter, quote, you created these platforms and now they're being misused, and you have to be the ones to do something about it, or we will. Social media companies react to incentive structures, including threats. They've responded by adopting the standards of third-party left-wing informational safety groups like the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, or GARM.
What Ben Shapiro's going to leave out, because he likes to talk fast. And by the way, talking fast doesn't mean that you're more intelligent. But what he is going to omit from this conversation is that the Supreme Court, the right-wing Supreme Court, actually approved and backed Biden's administration, allowing the government to tell social media companies what they can and cannot have on their platform. Ben doesn't want to tell you that. I told you about that. I shared that story on the show. He's leaving that out because, again, his job is to keep it partisan. His job is not to have some type of unity across the board. He makes his money by keeping it partisan. But you had a right-wing Supreme Court that backed Joe Biden administration, allowing the government to infiltrate these social media companies and telling them what they can and cannot have on their platform and to suppress information. So that's not just something the Democrats did. The right-wing Supreme Court now approved it. So they agree with it too. Both parties are against free speech.
GARM purportedly sets brand safety standards, objective standards by which advertisers and platforms can supposedly determine just what sort of content ought to be deemed safe for advertising. In reality, GARM acts as a cartel. Its members account for 90% of ad spending in the United States, almost $1 trillion. In other words, if you're not getting ad dollars from GARM members, it's nearly impossible to run an ad-based business. And if you're not following their preferred political narratives, the ones that Kara Swisher and Dianne Feinstein would follow, you will not be deemed brand safe.
You have the same narrative that people have to follow. That's why this is so hypocritical to me, you guys. Let's think about this again. What did the Daily Wire say? You got to be pro-Israel? Who is Ben Shapiro to talk about any network or company having a narrative that is approved and you have to follow that narrative? He's doing the same thing. The same thing. That's why this is laughable to me. I'm surprised they didn't laugh him out of the room.
Business will be throttled. We at Daily Wire have experienced this firsthand. In 2017, after Senator Feinstein made her threats to bring the weight of government down on social media platforms, Daily Wire YouTube channel saw a 1,000% increase in content enforcements over a 2-year period. Since 2021, after Democrat officials further turned up the heat on social media companies, my personal Facebook page has seen an over 80% drop in impressions. Or take Joe Rogan. When Joe said that he had taken ivermectin after getting COVID, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki pressured Spotify to take action, stating, quote, "We want every platform to be doing more to call out mis- and disinformation while also uplifting accurate information."
And the Daily Wire did the same thing. And so did Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro and all his Zionist buddies, they all went after people on Twitter. Those of you on Twitter, you saw this probably. They all went after people on Twitter, calling for people to be deplatformed, calling for people to be removed because they were supporting the Palestinian people. Let's all go back and let's remember this. Let's remember how Ben Shapiro and a whole group of people, him, Bill Ackman, a bunch of them all got together and ganged up on the university presidents because they said, oh, you got to be pro-Israel and you let the students have the protest. All of them ganged up on these people, demanding that they be removed from their jobs. And now Ben Shapiro is sitting in Congress because it appears it may have happened to his company. I don't see how people, I don't know how people fall for this. I really don't see how people fall for this guy.
Spotify complied. Spotify, of course, works with GARM. So what are the brand safety standards that GARM uses? The standards begin with inarguable things that we've heard from the other witnesses, like preventing distribution of child sexual abuse material or stopping terrorism. But GARM doesn't draw the line at what is criminal, abusive, or dangerous. Their standards also include restrictions on hate speech, harassment, misinformation, or my personal favorite, insensitive, irresponsible, and harmful treatment of debated sensitive social issues. Those criteria are highly subjective in theory, and they are purely partisan in practice. For example, last year, Daily Wire host Matt Walsh was fully demonetized on YouTube, a GARM member. Why? For quote-unquote misgendering, which to GARM is to say that men are not women. Perfectly obvious facts now run afoul of GARM's censorship standards. Companies targeted by GARM, like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, Fox News, and so many others, reach hundreds of millions of people with opinions and beliefs long established as within the mainstream of American conservative thought. GARM and its members have no respect for the beliefs of those people. They would like them marginalized or squashed. It's time to stand up for the First Amendment in this Congress. Congress can do so in two ways. First,
time to stand up for the First Amendment. You of all people, are you kidding me? Stand up for the First Amendment, but you must be pro-Israel. Stand up for the First Amendment, but don't you support those Palestinians in Gaza. Stand up for the First Amendment, but don't you dare walk down the street wearing a keffiyeh. Stand up for the First Amendment. There was a guy who was just fired for wearing a Palestinian pin on an airline. Stand up for the First Amendment, but don't you dare wear that Palestinian pin on your uniform. As if these people are supposed to hide and not let people know where they're from or who they are. Stand up for that, Ben. Stand up for the First Amendment, but tell all these university kids what they can and cannot talk about on the goddamn campus. But stand up for the First Amendment. Stand up for the First Amendment, but don't march down the street and protest and yelling the word intifada. Don't protest and say from the river to the sea, but it's okay for Netanyahu to say it. Don't protest and tell people to free Palestine. Stop saying that Palestine ever existed, but stand up for the First Amendment. This is a joke, and more people need to call this out. Because what we have learned over time is that when it comes to Israel, that whole First Amendment bullshit goes right out the window, whether they're on the right or the left.
Congress must investigate the informal and perhaps formal arrangements between censorship cartels like GARM and executive branch agencies. The Daily Wire has already filed a federal lawsuit against the State Department for allegedly doing just this. Second, Congress can itself stop engaging in violation of free speech principles. 2 weeks ago, writing in dissent in Murphy versus Missouri, Justice Alito condemned what he called sophisticated and coercive government campaigns against free speech.
Pause. Congress can stop this. Congress, just a couple of months ago, were trying to pass legislation to change the definition of what it means to be anti-Semitic. You know how dangerous that was? You expect Congress to do this? Oh, but I forget. That's something that Ben would agree with, so that works for him. So he's totally fine with that because that benefits him. Here's the thing again about the censorship, and I've said it before. Whether I agree with the person or not, I never say they should be deplatformed, whether I agree with them or not. Because once you do that, it's only a matter of time before there's someone that you do agree with on the issue and they're deplatformed. Censorship is universal. Censorship doesn't just pick and choose. Oh, I think I'm just going to go after right-wing people today. I mean, so that's a big part of the problem. So if Ben Shapiro was so pro-free speech as he claims, he would have stayed completely out of the rhetoric and everything that was being said during those protests. He would have stayed out of that. The same guy who sat up there and he sang in this video with this other guy, I don't even know who this dude is. He sang in this video with this rapper saying, I don't care if I offend you and facts don't care about your feelings. Apparently that applied to everything except when it came to Zionism, except for when it came to Israel. So people can say whatever they want about me, but you don't hear me on this show calling for people to be deplatformed. Ben Shapiro was literally calling for people to be fired, removed, and deplatformed. But free speech.
Members of this committee have engaged in precisely such campaigns. When Congressman Schiff speaks about targeting social media companies that must be, quote, pulled and dragged into this era of corporate responsibility because they are too tolerant of misinformation, he knows what he is doing. He is participating in a sophisticated, coercive campaign against free speech. When Congresswoman Jayapal blames social media for placing America at the, quote, precipice of a democratic crisis and calls on them to target they deem hate groups, she also knows what she is doing. She is participating in a sophisticated, coercive campaign against free speech. When Congressman Hank Johnson says, quote, we need a constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to control the so-called free speech rights of corporations, he also knows what he is doing. We all know what these government actors, what some people in this room, are doing. You're using the tacit threat of government action to compel private companies to throttle viewpoints you don't particularly like. The First Amendment was not designed to enable workarounds by elected official. It was directed at Congress, at you, and you're abdicating your fundamental duty when you exert pressure on private companies to censor speech. Some in this room have been doing just that for years. We in the non-legacy media have been feeling the effects. In the name of the Constitution and in the name of democracy, this should stop.
What a fucking joke. Yes, thank you for this, Edward. Meta is now censoring the word Zionist. Yeah, that is true. I was reading about that the other day. That's how far it has gone. So he's full of shit. And the reality is, folks, I don't know how many times I got to say it, but when it comes to both of these parties, both parties support censorship. It's just a matter of what issues they want to censor. If you're new, come and join the post-duopoly club with me. It's not just me. There's a bunch of others too. My comrades over at Revolutionary Blackout Network, Kit from Hardlands Media. I'm not alone. Not alone.